In the Old Testament times, there was no such a thing as an irreligious kingdom or state atheism, like the modern world has it in some shape or form since the French Revolution. Gods were very much alive and kicking in the Old Testament, and there is not so much of a question if some gods exist or not, as much as the competition of power and a question of which gods were the most powerful. While there were sun gods, moon gods, animal gods, gods of water, and gods of fire, from the beginning, the God of Israel and of Abraham revealed himself as the creator God who made everything there is. He made the sun and the moon and the stars and the waters and the land and the animals and the humans, everything. So in this respect, God claimed to be above every other God. And talking is always easy. But doing is a different thing altogether. So very early in the biblical story, there was a conflict between God of Israel and gods of Egypt. And the God of Israel did not simply say, I am the true God or the most powerful God, but he demonstrated his divine authority by systematically defeating the gods of Egypt through the 10 plagues. And later on in the story, God is again in the conflict with the gods of Babylon, just like he was in a conflict with the gods of Egypt. And again, he overpowered and defeated the gods of Babylon, just as he did in Egypt. And even though occasionally God claims that he is the only God and there is none besides him, through all these Old Testament stories, this statement does not push forward the idea that all these other gods are imaginary, fictional, and non-existent characters. There is something real going on, but all these so-called gods are not the ones who created the heavens and the earth, and these so-called gods are not able to save or deliver. Therefore, in this overall context of the Old Testament, all things come from the true and only God. All things come from him, both good and evil things. And occasionally you read in the Old Testament that God sometimes causes or sends evil upon people. In the Old Testament context, this is all fine, it's all right and proper. For if God was not in charge of all things, there must be some other God or other gods who are more powerful than the God of Israel, higher than him. So whatever happens in the Old Testament appears to come directly from God. There are just a few occasional glimpses of something else lurking behind going on, like in the book of Job, where the evil and calamities that afflicted Job came from Satan rather than from God. Still, it is God who has to give permission for this to happen, or it would not happen at all. But there are more confusing events, such as when the King David did a census of Israel and he counted all the people to see how great his nation was, and was eventually punished by God for this act. Now, two records of this event. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, it's stated that Satan incited David to do the census. On the other hand, in 2 Samuel chapter 24, it's claimed that God himself caused David to do the census. So who was it? Was it God or was it Satan? This is the question you and I would ask, but for the people of the Old Testament, it was not a relevant question. Why? Because in the Old Testament context, God is in charge of everything. And here is another example. 1 Samuel 16:14, it says, But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. Now, I tend to use New King James Version these days because, generally speaking, it is more accurate than other translations. But in this case, New King James Version translates the words evil spirit as distressing spirit, unlike the other translations which use the word evil, which is the actual Hebrew word used in this text. This is one of the reasons I am saying what I'm saying today. Some people, even committed Bible translators, feel very uncomfortable with this Old Testament arrangement of the mixture of the demonic and the divine, God and evil. And if you read just this text or some other similar text, you may feel troubled, just like the New King James Version translators. Translators obviously felt troubled here, and consequently they used the softened word distressing spirit rather than the correct word evil. But if you read this in the overall context of the Bible and in a chronological context, you can follow a story that is gradually unfolding and gradually revealing more and more details. You don't read much about demonic possession in the Old Testament. King Saul, as this text portrays, King Saul is one example I can recall that somewhat resembles this condition. King Saul was a troubled character who eventually turned to the occult. He consulted a witch, he engaged in a seance with the spirits of the dead, so he had a relationship with the demonic evil powers. And obviously, as this text in 1 Samuel says, the evil spirit troubled him after the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. But even this evil spirit seems to come from God, from the Lord. And this is how it is in the Old Testament. It is not until the New Testament, and specifically the Gospels, where there is a comprehensive presentation of the demonic activities. And for the first time in the biblical story and in the biblical canon, there is a clear distinction between God and the demonic forces. It is only after the arrival of Jesus Christ on the scene that a clear separation between the divine and the demonic is finally revealed to us. And immediately after his baptism, Christ was assailed by the demonic, by the devil. And moreover, it is revealed in one of the three temptations that it is not God, but actually the devil that is in charge of this world and all its kingdoms. You don't find this in the Old Testament at all. If this was revealed in the Old Testament, then God that we know through Jesus Christ would not be considered the true God at all if he was not in charge. So if we read the storyline of the Bible in its entire chronological context, it is not until the appearance of Jesus Christ that there is a clear line of distinction drawn between God and the demonic. There are few hints in the Old Testament, but nothing clear, nothing clear. So when spirits or angels appear in the Old Testament, it is not always clear whether these are God's representatives or the demonic characters. The clear distinction is just not there in the Old Testament like it is in the New Testament writings. Let us now consider the key representative of the demonic forces as he is revealed to be in the book of Ezekiel. So I'm reading from the book of Ezekiel, chapter 28, 13 to 16. You were in Eden, the garden of God. You were the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of the fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you. By the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. Therefore, I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. This is what we are told about this creature, this cherub, one of those creatures that appears very early in the visions of the book of Ezekiel by the spinning wheels. You were the anointed cherub, and you were in Eden, the garden of God. Now, the first time the word cherub is mentioned in the Bible is actually in the Garden of Eden, at the very beginning of the story of the Bible. And we are told in Genesis 3:24, so he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Was this cherub an angel of God or a demonic angel? In the Old Testament context, this is an irrelevant question. It doesn't matter. It could be either. The main point is that this cherub becomes the agent of death, as he is the one who prevents humankind from accessing the tree of life, so they cannot live forever anymore. What is interesting is that in the New Testament, the one who is called the agent of death, or who has power over death, is called the devil. And the book of Hebrews, chapter 2, verse 14, tells us this. Inasmuch, then, as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself, that's Jesus, likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. And as we rewind the story, in the very beginning, in the Garden of Eden, we have three parties, not two parties, we have three parties. God, humankind, and the serpent. There is a conflict. And then we have three characters mentioned again after this conflict. God, humankind, and this cherub who seems to come out of nowhere and who now becomes the agent of death. As the readers of the New Testament writings, we would say that this cherub in the Garden of Eden was not a demonic, evil angel, but it was a God's angel. But in the Old Testament, as this actually is written in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, the clear distinction between the demonic and the divine does not exist, as all angels and all spirits come from God. And sometimes they're all called sons of God. So it could be either. In any case, as soon as God's direct presence departed from this earth, someone else jumped at the opportunity to step in and take charge. Christ calls this person the ruler of this world. Now, if there is no clear distinguishing line between God and the demonic in the Old Testament, what acts in the Old Testament then do we attribute to God? And what acts do we attribute to the demonic forces? That is a difficult one because the line of distinction is just not there in the Old Testament. It is only with the arrival of Christ, the Messiah, and the New Testament that we can see a clear distinction between the character and work of God through Christ and the character and work of the demonic or the devil through his evil angels. And it is very, very clear that there is no evil coming from Christ, no evil spirits coming from Christ, no diseases coming from Christ, no suffering coming from Christ. All these things come from this world that is somehow ruled by the devil. Moving forward into the present times, where does that leave you and me, who are well into the 21st century? And where for most of us, at least in this society, for most of us, the demonic forces appear to be irrelevant. When people today consider evil and suffering, in this context where the demonic forces are irrelevant, God is automatically blamed as the one who is responsible for all things, just like in the Old Testament times. Consequently, some people blame God while other people reject God. And on the one end of the spectrum, we have the believers who say that all things come from God. While on the other end of the spectrum, we have the atheists who say that nothing comes from God. So while the pendulum keeps swinging like on the clock on the wall, from side to side, from one end to the other, the only safe place for you and me is to stay balanced right at the center of the pendulum. The only place from where we can see that there are some things that come from God and that there are some things that do not come from God. And there is only one point at the center of the pendulum, and that point is Jesus Christ. He is at the center of all things. If we remove ourselves from Him, either to the left or to the right, we will lose perspective. And we may lose so much more. Christ is our only glasses, our only periscope through which we can see God's kingdom and God as He truly is. He is our only way out of this broken world and into God's unbroken kingdom. He is the light that shines and reveals all truth.